Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And I don't know about you, but I am super excited for the new Infinity War movie to be coming out. And we wanted to see how far we could drag that into our podcast's purview.
Right, yeah. Considering this may come as a shock to most of you listeners. Actually, it's probably not. That me and Geoff are huge nerds about a great many things, not just video games. And Infinity War is kind of huge for me as a comic book fan and a nerd growing up on Marvel cartoons, is that it's 10 years in the making. All of the storylines in the previous Marvel Cinematic Universe movies are leading to this movie. And so I'm very excited to get to see this movie. As of this release, I will hopefully already seen it, since this will come out about a week after the movie. But there has been a lot of superhero movies in the last 10 to 15 years with both great and terrible video game related properties, as well as there have been a ton of brand new heroes created within the gaming generation pretty much since, back in the 8-bit days. We've been dealing with original IP heroes and adaptations since the 8-bit era and beyond. And so I thought it might be fun to tie in with our discussion about the MCU and loving or hating these Marvel movies, talking about superheroes in gaming, both original IP superheroes versus adaptations of comic books and movies and TV when it relates to superheroes as well, because there's been a ton of both.
Yes, there has, and it's always so interesting to see how sort of where it's pulled from, because I definitely feel a lot of the original IPs that are made for video games are basically, well, we don't want to have to get the rights to this character, so there's nothing that says it can't be these power sets, these anything else.
Sure, yeah. Well, and also think about, like your even kind of human superheroes, like your Nathan Drakes, are clearly influenced by Indiana Jones, but they weren't. Like, if that game was transformed into an Indiana Jones game, I don't think it would be any worse for wear. But the fact that they didn't want to have to get the rights to the IP, but they wanted to make a similar kind of character, so they created a new one.
And, well, Nathan's a good deal more snarky, I think, than Indy.
That's fair.
Yeah, Indiana Jones is a very dry character, but I don't think he has quite the same swashbuckling wit that Nathan Drake does. And so that lets them kind of move away from the character if the writing so determines it, which is a very nice bit of freedom that you can give yourself in a narrative game.
Yeah, and I mean, I know in the past we've talked about truly horrible games. I believe the X-Men NES game has come up more than once on this podcast.
Yes, and and listeners, if you still haven't experienced any form of it, watch a video. I can't condone downloading a ROM, but if you do, that's an excellent way to see it as well, to truly experience. Wow.
Yeah, the horror. And we even talked a little bit last week about how Superman 64 is one of the worst games ever made, followed up by a close second, probably the Aquaman game for GameCube, as far as adaptations go that are awful. And so the thing is, when dealing with adaptations, of books, TV, movies, especially when dealing with superheroes, is how can you best convey these heroes in a way, that doesn't hurt the source material. And we've talked about adaptations in the past, but specifically with superheroes, you have to think about how long it took them to get Batman, finger quotes, right in gaming. You know, it wasn't until the last generation when we got Arkham Asylum that it felt like you were playing as Batman. Whereas in previous games, you know, the Batman games had been influenced by Batman's material, but for the most part, it was a lot of punch and kick or throwing a batarang, and it more felt like a brawler or a shooter, even with throwing batarangs. There was never that sense of stealth really until the modern gaming generation, or even with Telltale's new narrative version that also feels more like Batman because it's more like a visual comic book.
It lends itself more towards being a detective story.
Right, exactly. Which I think is really cool to have those things in modern generation. But going back to the MCU a little bit, something that's happened in recent years with the MCU and with Fox's X-Men series and Sony's Spider-Man series is this idea that every movie release needs a game released with it. In fact, Arkham Asylum started as a Batman Begins game, and then they diverged. We got a Batman Begins game that was okay, but then Arkham Asylum came out around the same time as The Dark Knight, and it became its own thing because of what went into it.
Well, and it also got to be, it started as a Christopher Nolan Batman and became a Batman the Animated Series Batman. And that kind of leads into where I think a great deal of strengths can happen in a video game adaptation. If they're trying to adapt a film directly, you've got about 3 hours of material. Let's assume for deleted scenes, some production Bible stuff, and everything else. Like, that is what you're mining from. And then sometimes you have to create sequences in between that, like, oh, we didn't show this because, well, now we want a motorcycle chase. Or, oh, we need some more combat-based stuff. Whereas if you're adapting from just the comic book character themselves, you don't even necessarily have to do a singular storyline. You've got the width and breadth of a character's history that the films get when they adapt to the screen. Like, if you're pulling from the comics, you're pulling from the source in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you adapt from a TV show or adapt from a movie, you're making an adaptation of an adaptation. And it's like slowly choking out the amount you can do. I feel like the X-Men games and the X-Men movie adaptation games are not good.
No.
But they've definitely done some of the more interesting things, in my experience, in adapting from the movies. Like, they did an X2 video game that focused on the events after X-Men 2. It was where you got your canon explanation for why Nightcrawler wasn't in the third movie. It was because Alan Cumming didn't want to go through all of the makeup again. But as somebody who loves Nightcrawler as much as I do, and I'm sure a lot of people do, it's nice to have that explanation somewhere, I guess.
Sure. Well, it's like also with X-Men Origins, it was one of the worst comic book movies ever made. But the game based on it was actually good because even though the story was still kind of lacking, the gameplay made you actually feel like Wolverine. It had real-time regeneration. It had like you actually slicing people into pieces. And so it was the first rated R Wolverine project before we got Logan. And so that was kind of cool, even though the story was still pretty weak because it was following origins and then like filling time in between and jumping back between modern time and flashbacks. It was very bizarre. But again, the gameplay was really solid, which made it for a fun game anyway.
Yeah, no, and that definitely makes for a stronger adaptation as well when a video game can give you something that no other piece of media can, where you feel like you're that character. Anybody who's played Hulk Ultimate Destruction kind of knows what I mean. Is it a great game? It's not going to go down in the annals of time. But was it the first game where you played as the Hulk, where you really felt like the Hulk? Yes. You could destroy everything. You could. It had like the car boxing glove thing where you could like smash into a car and the car is now something you're punching with. And you could just leap and go and you felt like the Hulk. And
that was one of those games that was born out of the open world era, which was really started by Grand Theft Auto, but then in the superhero genre, Spider-Man 2, which was based on the Spider-Man 2 movie. And the great thing about that game is that it did add story between the major story points that were side missions that still felt like you were getting something out of it. And of course, the web slinging was one of the most visceral, felt like you were Spider-Man moments. However, after that, they kept trying to bottle that lightning, and Spider-Man 3 was tedious and boring. The Amazing Spider-Man game, based on the Amazing Spider-Man movie, was also tedious, and that's because the material it was based on, trying to literally shoehorn the movie into this game, made it weaker. But we're coming back around full circle because now Insomniac Games, who's a very famous publisher for Sony at this point, has made a ton of really great games. They have the Spider-Man IP, and they are making a wholly original Spider-Man game that doesn't take from any of the movies. It's taking from the comic books, but it's creating its own story, using Negative Man as one of the lead villains, who has not really been featured anywhere before. Is kind of a really cool backswing to knowing how to use an adapted IP in an original way, which I think is what ultimately is the strength of having some original IP characters. I mean, think about all the way back to like Nintendo and Super Nintendo. Mega Man X and Mega Man were essentially superheroes created by Capcom. You know, Vector Man on the Sega Genesis, which was sort of a ripoff of Mega Man, was also his own kind of robotic hero. Like, original IP characters have existed since 8-bit, but it wasn't until, you know, the modern generation of consoles where we got these really in-depth storytelling with those original characters.
Yeah, well, and I mean, even Mega Man is a comic adaptation because they made Mega Man because they wanted to make an Astro Boy game.
Right.
And they couldn't get the rights. So a lot of wonderful original IPs have happened because, well, we couldn't get the rights there. We have Donkey Kong because Nintendo couldn't get the Popeye rights.
Right.
What a different world we could be living in.
Right, exactly, if that were a Popeye game instead.
Oh my gosh. But yeah, I mean, and in the past few generations, you get something like Infamous.
Yep.
Which is a very like straight up comic book style game with the open world and morality system that you would find in like a BioWare game.
Yeah, for sure. And it takes this character who's got these powers of electricity, but they're not as straightforward as, say, the Shocker or Electro is in the comic books because they're creating their own IP. He can use them to glide on telephone wires. He can use it to manipulate people. He can use it to travel. He can use it to fight. Like, they really kind of created this interesting idea that electricity in all its forms, in all its places, when that can be manipulated more than generated, what does that look like? And I thought it was a really neat way to create a character like that. And having this morality system allowed you to play like a hero or a villain, essentially, which also added an interesting concept to the game.
They were able to take the idea of like, okay, we're going to make a new comic book style character, but they're not beholden to their comic book roots. So you can develop their powers so that they suit gameplay. And we live in that modern era where, I mean, also something that I've read in different things is a Western versus Eastern style of thought on like superpowers or strange happenings, whatever else. In like, say, a manga, typically you could just say this weird thing is happening. People go, okay. In America, this weird thing is happening. But why? How does that work? Let me think of all of the bizarre applications. And look, people like us who make podcasts and the people who make YouTube content and everything else, we are creating a world of like, all right, let us find every nook and cranny and how these things fit and how they work. So being able to create a character whole cloth for a video game so that the powers suit the game and then go, all right, well, this is a fairly generic-ish power, even though there's not really a lot of heroes. I mean, you got your Static Shock and Black Lightning as well. But like, okay, what can electricity do to people? And you can really explore that. And it is a definite advantage of the original IP, but it also cuts down on sales, and there's a lot of things to consider.
Sure. And I think also looking at original IPs in an interesting way, you know, think about Overwatch, Blizzard's first-person shooter property. The idea of Overwatch is this essentially a Justice League of characters who came together to fight, you know, enemies and protect people. And, you know, all of them are interesting takes on superpowers, you know.
True.
And or robots and science and tech. And so, like, I always thought that was very cool. Also, like, what if we take Hawkeye, but place him in Japan and give him the spirit of a dragon? You know, you get Hanzo and this character who is, you know, essentially a glorified Hawkeye, quote unquote, ripoff. But when you give him, or actually closer to Green Arrow, because he has a variety of arrows.
True.
But then give him some mysticism and some other stuff that makes the character more than. And while their base might not have been Hawkeye, you can't argue that the idea is possibly a little influenced by it, as well as archers from Japanese culture as well. And, you know, while that's not your traditional superhero game, a lot of those characters within Overwatch feel very much like superheroes and supervillains.
They absolutely do. It has that big kind of wham bam soap opera sort of feel. Yes. That is certainly what a lot of people think of when they think of like the big two and their superhero comics. Because again, comics as a genre is very wide, very multifaceted, very subtle. But we're in this conversation, we are talking about, MCU style stuff, DC Comics, very, very big superhero style stuff, which again, as we're finding, fits really well into the video game genre, or video game medium, depending on really what you do with it and where you pull from. And yeah, Overwatch is great. It's a nice showcase of there aren't very many like fantastical power sets that belong to any one person,
Right.
and you can sort of change where it comes from, and you do get an interesting different character. And yes, there is the fact that like Hawkeye and Green Arrow, you look at and you kind of go, are they ripping off each other? And you go, no, Green Arrow's ripping off Batman. DC's ripping off themselves. It's all okay.
Right.
But yeah, you give somebody a bow and arrow in a gunfight and you kind of go, oh, well, what are we doing? Some Hawkeye shit here? It's like, well, maybe, but probably not.
Right. And also I think it's interesting to point out that, a lot of these adaptations and evolutions based on previous mediums, we were talking about the MCU earlier, and me and Geoff are very much fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and all
Yes.
the movies to come out. But when those get adapted to games, there tends to be a failing in a different way, because it's not just a straight adaptation of the movie, which could be a failing on its own, but also all of those movies are so interconnected, and TV shows and whatever else, that when you make a movie game that's supposed to stand alone, like the Thor game, it's going to fall short, because if you're basing it just on the Thor movie, there's not a lot of video game content there. It's a lot of story development and realizing your morals and growing as an individual, which doesn't make for interesting gameplay unless you make it narrative driven, which they sure as hell didn't.
Yeah.
It ends up just coming off as a cheap beat 'em up that doesn't really have any interesting, because you're not translating the Kevin Feige touch, essentially, this idea of interconnectedness, which would make the games better, which is why I'm glad after like the second wave of Marvel movies, they stopped trying to make games based on the movies and then just started trying to have simultaneous releases of games that are about things in the Marvel universe instead.
Yeah, that are about those characters. Like,
Right.
I feel like across the board, Guardians of the Galaxy is kind of one of the great surprises, where a lot of people did not know much about the Guardians of the Galaxy before the first movie came out. And we didn't have to know about it. We knew it was Marvel, and we loved that movie. I love that movie, and I love its sequel as well. And it also has a video game adaptation, but it's a Telltale game. And when you consider all of like the
Yep.
big craziness that goes on in those movies, you're like, oh man, we could have like a space shooter. We could have this. It's like, all right, we're gonna have a sort of visual novel style game. Cool. These things don't have to necessarily be one-to-one. You just need to find what feels like the character, not necessarily their powers, not necessarily their setting. What feels like the characters. I remember before Arkham Asylum ever came out, a fairly common opinion, and I'm pretty sure I've brought this up in episodes before, when the first Assassin's Creed came out, people were pretty much like, okay, this feels more like Batman than any other Batman game has ever felt.
Right.
So you can be almost setting agnostic and still get the feel of certain characters. And something that I think would be kind of interesting, it's probably a little too late to release it, but rather than doing direct one-to-one adaptations of Marvel films, it would have been really interesting to almost do a Road to Avengers kind of game, where there were segments and pieces where you played as the different characters. And in the past, it is a very tricky tightrope to walk to get multiple characters into a game and have different play styles. But I think that would have been a much stronger thing, so you could get the feel of each hero right and not have to worry about like how many levels, how many hours of gameplay can we get out of it. You can just work it all together, and people will love the interconnectedness of it all too. So,
Well, yeah, I think the closest games to get that right were the X-Men Legends / Marvel Ultimate
Alliance. Yeah, those were
games,
great. I love those games.
which had a mix of that stuff and these stories that were fairly independent of the movies they were released with, but would have features based on the movie. Like in a Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, you get some of the movie costumes and stuff like that. But, yeah, I think that also, we're in this weird place now where there are adaptations of adaptations of adaptations. And what
Right.
I mean by that is take a look at Lego. Especially let's take a look at Lego Batman, which first there was Batman, then there was Lego Batman, and those early games were just based on Batman stories or Batman characters, but it was still a cutesy Lego game, which then Lego eventually made their own movie and had a spin-off with Lego Batman that was separate from comic book Batman, which then that got its own game, which was different from the Lego games and was based on the Lego Batman movie. And so it's like this cyclical process that Lego has done a really great job with creating these content based on other content. And have also released Lego superhero games, Marvel games as well, that either follow a story of the comic book, maybe loosely follows one of the movies, and all of that stuff that has allowed them to grow this property within a property. That's kind of just loosely based at that point. Once you're getting to the Lego Marvel superheroes games, they're kind of just loosely based on comic books and the characters, but they're kind of creating their own narratives influenced by their history and not necessarily picking from specifically a movie or specifically a comic book or specifically a cartoon. It's kind of pulling from everything and creating their favorite version of it.
Well, and making it a Lego thing, that is sort of a dual adaptation because they are free to kind of do whatever they want with the characters in a way, because you can always just go, well, it's Legos. Like, how realistic are we talking here? And so that gives them a great freedom to make some delightful choices. And also a lot of the things that are done in the games kind of lean on the fact that they're Lego. On like the building of things, on the adaptation of like pull this off and put that on. It influences the gameplay. It influences the decisions of characters, both heroic and villainous. And it allows, like, both of those things, you play a little fast and loose, and you kind of get as somebody who owns all 3 Lego Batman games, a very enjoyable experience and a good multiplayer experience too, which you don't usually get in superhero games, which, again, the X-Men Legends and Marvel Ultimate Alliance games, it lets people pick a hero that they want to be and either stick with them through the whole game or swap them around or anything else. And because we're seeing, or it's now more mainstream, that the comic book universes are so very rich with characters, you don't necessarily have to say, oh, I don't like comic books or I don't like comic book movies. You can say, I like that character. People can not enjoy the Thor movies, except Thor 3. You must love Thor 3.
That's true.
Or, like, you might not enjoy some of the later Iron Man movies or one thing or another thing, but it's like you can enjoy it in general and you can enjoy it in specifics. And that's a failing also that comes into adaptation to video game, where it's like, I don't like comic book video games. Or you can just enjoy, like, I like being characters where I can just run around and smash stuff up. I like being ones where it's a little more thoughtful and sneaky. I like the ones where it's, very moral decisions. It's something that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has done very intelligently, is they are trying to break the idea of it's just a superhero movie. And these things are genres unto themselves, where Ant-Man is a little more of a heist, where Captain America the Winter Soldier was like a political thriller with a super soldier, where, Thor 3 was just like gonzo weirdo spacefaring. Like, they're all different genres of film that are under a common banner, which is something that I think video games can take a nice cue from.
Yeah, because once you just start catering to the character and less a specific, like calling it a comic book game and then not worrying and then like not actually diving deeper into what kind of game it could be, it could leave you, it could just leave this emptiness in the game that's obvious to see. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, like, I'm excited about the new Sony Spider-Man game, because, again, it seems like they're pulling from somewhere original now. They have a writer that's just writing this story. It's an original story influenced by the comic books, and so I'm very excited about it. But that said, I've bought almost every Spider-Man game they've ever released because I like Spider-Man. So I have kind of a bias there. Whereas with Infamous, I played the first Infamous. I never finished it. I got for free the most recent Infamous, Second Son.
Second Son, yeah.
which I haven't played yet, but I hear is a standalone, like a continuation, but a standalone story, which I'll eventually play. But so I don't have really that allegiance to that original IP character because I wasn't hooked early on. Whereas other original IPs I've super gotten into late and super loved. Like I mentioned Uncharted earlier, I love that series, and I haven't finished the third one. I haven't played the fourth one yet, but like I got really involved really quick, and I keep wanting to go back to it. I think that's something that can be hit or miss for both original IPs and comic book superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
Is you need a level of already invested to sell those things, and it's a little bit easier with the superhero IPs that exist already because there's some brand recognition there, whereas a character that was only created on PlayStation 3 doesn't have as much of a history, and so they may not get linked into. Now, going back to Mega Man, I mean, Mega Man's been around since Nintendo, and they're releasing the Legacy Collections, which we talked about last week a little bit, or 2 weeks ago, as it were. And like, so there's that original IP character based on Astro Boy that's its own character that definitely has that legacy of loyalty to it, and the reason that they're making a new Mega Man game later this year and releasing these collections as well is to bank on that loyalty.
Yeah, bank on that legacy. And that is an advantage that, yeah, adapted IPs can have, where you may not necessarily be able to do every last thing in a superhero game or a comic book game, but you can make all kinds of sly little references. You can have names of NPCs be, obscure characters. You can have those sort of references, which they also do in the movies, where there can be dozens of references that go right over your head, and then there's someone else who sees all of them and gets this like extra level of enjoyment out of it. And that's something that actually Mega Man's been able to do as well, between recurring characters or music that happens or like old locations. I remember like one that pops off the top of my head right now is in Mega Man X4. In the Frost Walrus stage, they have in the background 2 previous ice-themed Mega Man X bosses frozen in ice. You start off like first screen, ready, you pop in, Blizzard Buffalo's in the back. You go into one of the mini boss room, Chill Penguin is frozen there. And it's like, those could just be part of the background you don't even notice, but if you notice it, oh man, like what a little delight that you just got in the middle of your experience. And I mean, we can't say like, only games that have 30 years of legacy or decades of backstory can pull off something like that. I mean, games certainly reference IPs that have nothing to do with them all the time. But
Sure. Well, think about also, like, let's take a modern superhero-ish character who's only existed for a few generations, like Bayonetta. Bayonetta is a Sega character created. She's an Umbra Witch. She's got supernatural powers. And she's only had 2 games and is getting a third one later this year. I just started playing the first one again because I remember I had played it when it first came out, and I wasn't in the right frame of mind for something so ridiculous. But the story is completely unhinged and bizarre, but it's super self-referential. Like it doesn't care about breaking the fourth wall in kind of a Deadpool kind of way, or not making sense and just being ridiculous, because it's that kind of game. It wants to have that kind of off-the-wall, no-holds-barred, anything-can-happen story. And I haven't played the second one yet, but from what I hear, it's the same thing.
Oh, it's even more, yeah.
Where you take an original IP that can do the same thing, like Deadpool, which had a game last generation. And, like, I played it, I liked it, but I mostly liked it because it was Deadpool being Deadpool. The comedy was pretty tight, but the gameplay was not. It was a hack and slash beat 'em up that was super repetitive. I liked the combat and I liked the characters, but all in all,
it didn't progress.
Right. And so there's where, you could say that Deadpool more or less owns a lot of that kind of fourth wall breaking bizarro-ness, and yet Bayonetta did it better. And now they're not a one-to-one comparison, but I'm just trying to say that original IPs can sometimes get away with something that something established can't. But
right.
Sometimes that just falls to game design and not even the characters, because Bayonetta is just a better designed game than the Deadpool game was.
Right. Well, and another example of a character that makes me think of comic books is Travis Touchdown from the No More Heroes games,
yes,
which is also getting a sequel soon. And that's one where, again, they could really... It was almost like a... No More Heroes strikes me as like a manga Scott Pilgrim in a way.
Yes, I can see that.
because it's that kind of like, okay, I've got sort of superpowers. I've got this super weapon, and I'm going to go become the world's greatest assassin by taking down some of the other great assassins. And I have to work mundane jobs and live my life in order to do this. And there's a lot of moments that sort of lean into being a video game where, like in the first game, the final boss, there is a segment where you learn their tragic backstory, but it's fast forwarded. Like it is a 15-second bit of like, that you see the little scan lines almost like when you're fast forwarding on a VHS tape and it all like goes through super fast. But if you slow it down, there is actually a 3-minute, very tragic backstory that I will not spoil that is told, and they just speed it up because fuck it, this is a video game. We just want to get to the fight.
Yeah.
And it is a great use of it's a different kind of fourth wall break than Bayonetta would use, even though there's witch time, or that Deadpool might use as well. And there again, they don't own it, and those are two characters that are made for video games that they can really lean into that. Frankly, anything Suda51 makes is a comic book. Whether Killer 7, Lollipop Chainsaw, No More Heroes, other games that I'm blanking on right now, I'm just on a tear. Like, they're all basically that sort of off-the-wall, kind of comic book, kind of super, maybe mundane insanity.
Sure. Well, and also, just a brief aside, if you've not been listening to the Nintendo Power podcast, which is essentially the Nintendo Power magazine in podcast form, I highly recommend it, especially because I believe their second episode is an interview with Suda51 about the new No More Heroes and his legacy and all of that. So I highly recommend checking that out. But you also, while talking about that, reminded me of another one of my favorite original IP characters that definitely got a bolster from existing universes was Beautiful Joe.
Yes.
I love the Beautiful Joe games.
Oh my God, yes.
This idea of kind of a Super Sentai, Power Ranger-esque superhero that comes into existence from this guy who's kind of just a schlub who loved those kinds of things is really awesome. And that essentially had to do it to save his girlfriend. And then in the second game, his girlfriend is also a Super Sentai superhero. Like,
yeah.
That's another one where it breaks the fourth wall, and like a lot of the cutscenes have like the old timey film strip squares on the bottom and top. These kinds of things that you can do with something brand new that you've created that you can't always get away with using something that exists. And again, if your story is compelling and your gameplay is tight, it doesn't matter if you're using an existing character or not. Like, one of the things that made the MMO Studio of Heroes great was that you could mix and match these different superpowers and play a character that felt wholly your own because the character creation process was so diverse. But at the end of the day, you're playing custom stories on in an existing world created by other people, but you're a damn superhero with Wolverine claws or with gadgets or with
whatever you make.
Yeah, and that also, I think things that let your imagination run free can be more satisfying for me. I like superhero tie-in content, and I will play every Spider-Man game they release till I die. Same with Wolverine game, and there are way more worse ones of those.
Oh yeah.
But that said, I think I tend to lean more towards the original IP characters or places, sandboxes where you can play in to create that stuff.
Yeah.
Because, like, superheroes are a thing I love. Like, there was this problem I always had when City of Heroes was still live, which for those who don't know, City of Heroes is a superhero version of World of Warcraft, essentially. You create your own character, there are different classes and different superpower sets. Every time I would go see a superhero movie in those early years, the X-Men and Spider-Man movies and the early Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, I would want to go home and create that character in City of Heroes and start a new character and play. Because every time I saw it in the movies, I would just be like, oh man, I want to go home and do that.
You want to make that happen. Yeah.
But that feeling has dwindled a bit because City of Heroes is dead, which is a shame, and there hasn't been a superhero MMO to come along that was as good. But also, it's one of those things that the content is so ever present, and there's so many different ways to present that content now that I've kind of let it exist in its own world, and it doesn't necessarily influence me to want to do other things. Now, that said, if City of Heroes existed again, that might change my mind. But for now, I've kind of learned to let those worlds exist separately, and I've been more fine-tuned to either Nintendo characters from my childhood who are original IPs or brand new original IPs, because that's just where my heart lies at the moment.
Right. Well, then let's kind of get some good closing questions here, and this is one I'm thinking on. Which superhero, like already existing Marvel, DC, what have you, character do you want to see adapted into a game that hasn't had a good one yet, or like you feel there is something missing? Like I feel like Green Lantern wouldn't quite translate well because you got to figure out all the designs and it would just feel samey no matter what. But like, what is one that you feel like hasn't gotten their due?
I mean, there's a few that I can think of off the top of my head. For the record, they did make a Green Lantern game based on the Ryan Reynolds movie.
Yes.
And it was passable. I played it, and it wasn't awful. Like, it was a fun beat 'em up, but it ultimately was samey. But that said, I didn't mind it so much.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. I mean, I think for me, my first choice would be Venom, because Venom is one of my favorite anti-heroes. And
Cool.
there was an Ultimate Spider-Man game that came out for the PlayStation generation that was based on the Ultimate Spider-Man comic books, where you could play as Spider-Man or Venom.
It was really good, too.
And that one was really good, but it wasn't focused on Venom. The focus was still mostly on Spider-Man, even though there was a full Venom campaign. But like Venom didn't get his ability to web sling till towards the end of the game. You know, he was still kind of a mindless monster most of the game. But I would like this game where you can kind of, you know, you use the symbiote and you're Venom limping around the city, but then there are also sections where you're not Venom, where you're Eddie Brock and you're doing some other stuff. Maybe something narrative driven would have been really nice, because there wasn't a ton of that.
Not enough investigative reporting in these games.
Right.
There really isn't.
So, you know, like it would be cool if something like LA Noire, like they took that system for like investigative reporting and mixed it with a Spider-Man open world game or something maybe.
I'd like that.
So that would be my first choice. And with the new Venom movie coming out under Sony, which I don't have high hopes for, honestly, even though I love Tom Hardy, I just don't think it's going to be good.
I have such a wait and see, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think my biggest problem is that Sony said this is isolated. The Marvel Universe can't have Venom. They can have Spider-Man, they can have anyone else, but Venom stays with us.
That's a shame.
It was a shame. But that said, if it can birth a really cool Venom game that's maybe also done by Insomniac Games in you know, simultaneous release or something, that would be really cool. Or maybe DLC for the new Spider-Man game where you can play as Venom and he gets his own campaign. I don't know.
That'd be nice.
But that would be my existing character that I'd really want to see a great solo game for.
Okay. Mine, The Flash.
Ha, yeah.
Because so many conventions of video games can be very easily adapted into The Flash's power set. Fast travel is already taken care of.
That's true.
Bullet time, slowdown, you can, depending upon how much you tap into the speed force or exhaustion or anything else, you have to like take people down. You can do all of that. I would love there to be a system of like, okay, it is already in canon. The Flash has to consume thousands upon thousands of calories to maintain his speed. So all of the video game food you have to eat anyway, already built in. There you go. Anytime you want to have like no clipping or like walk through walls, the Flash can do that. You have enough speed, you vibrate through walls. I feel there's a lot of wonderful video game conventions that are like right there and so easy to tap into. And I remember reading that there was a Game Boy Advance Flash beat 'em up that kind of tapped into that pretty nicely and did a good job of it, but I've never been able to track it down. And I think it would do kind of nicely in a modern open world game, because you really can get to anywhere in Central City pretty quickly when you're the Flash.
Yeah, no, I think that would be really cool. Like, just thinking about like City of Heroes and DC Online, which both had speedster style powers. Like, you would turn it on as a travel power, and then you would just run up buildings, down buildings, around buildings. Like, it was a very neat and cool thing. And so, a full game focused around the Flash, I think, would be really awesome.
You got time travel stuff you can do a little bit of, and he has, much like Spider-Man, an excellent rogue gallery of just utterly ridiculous characters.
Yeah.
So you really can have some ongoing campaigns or something big going on. And like, that's the one I feel like, I know there's not a good enough reason, but Justice League happened and there's the Flash TV show. And that's the character I feel like off the top of my head, like, give give Barry Allen, Wally West, any of them. Just give them something. You can even have like Flash Legacy stuff in there. I don't care. I think it'd be so cool.
I agree. I think that that would be the only problem with my Venom game that I want is Venom doesn't really have a large rogues gallery. Like Carnage is his ultimate villain and Spider-Man is his ultimate enemy. But beyond that, there would be a lacking in the supervillain department, which is maybe why he never got his own game. But now, Geoff, I want to pose a question to you.
All right.
Since we discussed a lot of original IP heroes and characters,
Mm-hmm.
is there one that's either had a series of games but hasn't had one in a while, or one who hasn't had one in a really long time that you would love to see get a resurgence in the current generation? I hinted at mine, which would be Beautiful Joe. I loved Beautiful Joe. And like, him appearing in Marvel vs. Capcom stuff, like I'm hoping Capcom will bring him back or remaster the first two games, since that's been kind of the trend.
Yeah.
But I would love for a new Beautiful Joe game. I loved that series. I enjoyed the gameplay. And so I think of all the original IP superhero adjacent things I've played, that would be the one that I'd want to see back in the current generation.
Okay. I'm not really sure which one I'd want. I mean, I'm happy that there's more Mega Man happening. I'm really happy there's more No More Heroes. God, I'm sure
I might have picked the only one that hasn't had a game in a while.
And you picked a good one too.
Yeah.
I will. I'm not sure. There's some good ones out there, and you know what? When I think of one, I'll post it to Twitter.
All right, fair enough. But yeah, I think that the thing that we can say about superheroes in gaming is that as long as you create a consistent logic or an inconsistent logic that's constantly inconsistent, you can generate a world that's easy to engage in. It's once you try and create Superman 64, where you're just flying because Superman flies, and so you're doing tricks in the air to fly, but he doesn't really, and like the action, like you have to create these rules that these characters follow and then keep it consistent and entertaining, because you don't want to make Superman fly just for the sake of flying. There should be a reason for it, and races are never a good reason.
Yes, exactly. So
I think that ultimately I'm excited for the Marvel Cinematic Universe to continue. I'm excited for Infinity War and to see what the overarching story will be after that, because everything's led up to this. So it's new territory again for the first time in a long time.
And we're going to, and actors age and people get out of contracts. And so let's see how this thing evolves. I'm super excited. Like, there can be so much high stakes involved because we've got real people. And yes, and I don't mean that in like these actors die. I mean in the sort of thing of like, okay, people aren't going to like it if you give Captain America to a new actor if Chris Evans leaves. So you could kill the character off. I don't know. I like that.
Yeah, for sure. I do too. But of course, as always, we love to open questions out to you guys listening. Let us know what your favorite superhero game is, your favorite original IP game is, what kind of things that you've noticed in the trend of adaptations, especially when it comes to superheroes specifically, and let us know how you feel about the modern generation of superheroes in other media. I'm very happy with Marvel and not so happy with DC, which tends to be the general consensus. But if you like the DC movies, tell us why. I'd love to hear reasons, because Lord knows I'm having trouble finding them, but maybe there's something I missed.
Yeah, or what are your favorite power sets to play in video games? Or what are some of your least favorite video game adaptations? Because it's always fun to hear about a good stinker.
I mean, the real question is, where is our Squirrel Girl game?
Where?
Yeah. Who doesn't want to watch Squirrel Girl beat up the Marvel Universe in video game form? I mean, let's be honest.
That would be so much fun.
But yes, thank you for listening as always. Please also check out our Certain Point of View Brethren, the Certain Point of View podcast, which is news and reviews every week. Another Past podcast, which is every other week. Case Aiken was recently a guest on our last episode. Of course, the Scruffy Nerf Herders, a D20 story, which is a D20 tabletop game DM'd by Case Aiken and played by Ben and Addie and others. And they go through this story between, I believe it's episode 2 and episode 3?
No, it's between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, right. Between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. And Please like and subscribe, all of that. Of course, write us a review. Send us your comments, critiques, and questions anywhere on the internet where you can find us. It's always a pleasure doing the show for you guys, and we will see you next time.
Yes, let's keep this conversation going, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.